February 1st, 1943. B-17F Flying Fortress, serial number 4124406, nicknamed All-American, lifted off from Biskra airfield in Algeria, carrying 10 crew members and a full bomb load for a mission against German targets in Tunisia. First Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg commanded the bomber from the pilot's seat, while his co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Godfrey Engel, sat to his right, and neither man had any indication that in approximately 90 minutes they would be flying an aircraft that should have been physically impossible to keep in the air. The mission proceeded normally through takeoff and formation assembly as the B-17 joined 35 other bombers from the 97th Bombardment Group heading toward their target, and the crews settled into the routine vigilance of combat flying, where German fighters could appear at any moment and where every minute in the air brought them closer to either completing their mission or becoming another casualty statistic. The formation approached its target area at 20,000 feet under clear skies that provided excellent visibility, but also made the bombers easy targets for German fighters operating from Tunisian airfields. The bombardier released the bomb load and the formation turned for home when German Me-109 fighters attacked from above and behind, using the sun to mask their approach. One Me-109 pilot lined up for a firing pass on All-American and opened fire with his cannons, scoring hits that damaged the bomber's No. 3 engine and punctured the fuselage in several places. The German pilot pressed his attack too aggressively and misjudged his closure rate on the bomber, and at approximately 09:30 hours, his Me-109 collided with All-American in a catastrophic impact that should have destroyed both aircraft instantly. The Messerschmitt's propeller struck All-American's fuselage just behind the radio compartment, and the spinning propeller blades, acting like a circular saw, carved through the bomber's aluminum skin and internal structure. The impact lasted perhaps 1 second, but in that time the propeller cut completely through the top of the fuselage, severed the main structural members, sliced through control cables running to the tail, and exited through the bottom of the aircraft, leaving a gaping wound that nearly separated the tail section from the rest of the bomber. The Me-109 continued through the collision with its propeller destroyed and its engine torn from the airframe, and the German fighter plummeted toward the desert below, killing its pilot on impact. Inside All-American, the crew experienced the collision as a massive impact, accompanied by the screaming sound of tearing metal and the sudden decompression as the fuselage split open to the outside air. Lieutenant Bragg fought the controls as the bomber pitched violently downward, and the tail section began waggling independently from the main fuselage because the structural connection between them had been severed, except for thin strips of metal skin along the sides and some control cables that somehow remained intact. The immediate question was whether the aircraft would break completely apart in the next few seconds, or whether Bragg could somehow stabilize it before the remaining structural connections failed. The damage extended approximately 8 feet along the fuselage in a diagonal cut that started just behind the radio compartment and angled downward toward the tail, and the cut was so deep that daylight was visible completely through the fuselage from top to bottom. The tail gunner Staff Sergeant Michael Zook was trapped in the tail section, which was now hanging from the main fuselage by what appeared to be nothing more than willpower and luck. The radio operator Technical Sergeant Elton Cannon found himself staring through the gaping wound at the ground 20,000 feet below, with nothing but wind rushing through the enormous hole where solid structure should have been. Lieutenant Bragg's first priority was preventing the aircraft from breaking apart completely, which meant minimizing any control inputs that would stress the remaining connections between the tail and fuselage. He eased back on the throttles to reduce airspeed because high speed would increase aerodynamic forces trying to rip the aircraft apart, and he very gently leveled the wings while avoiding any sudden movements that might snap the fuselage. The co-pilot, Lieutenant Engel, helped work the controls while simultaneously trying to assess the damage by looking back through the cockpit door, where he could see daylight streaming through the massive hole in the fuselage. The tail gunner, Sergeant Zook, faced the most immediate danger because the tail section was moving independently from the rest of the aircraft, with each gust of wind causing it to pitch and yaw erratically. He was essentially flying in a separate aircraft that was attached to the main bomber by threads, and if those threads broke, he would plummet to his death with no possibility of escape. Zook had no parachute within reach, because the collision had thrown equipment around the tail section, and even if he had a parachute, there was no way to bail out of the tail gunner position while the tail was still attached to the aircraft. His only option was to stay put and hope that Bragg could somehow keep the bomber together long enough to reach friendly territory. Lieutenant Bragg established a shallow descent at minimum safe airspeed, trying to reduce stress on the damaged structure, while also recognizing that they needed to cover approximately 200 miles to reach an airfield where they could attempt landing. The navigator calculated a course to the nearest Allied airfield, which was their departure point at Biskra, and Bragg aimed the damaged bomber toward that destination while constantly monitoring the aircraft's handling to detect any signs that the structural failure was progressing. Every minute they stayed in the air was a minute closer to potential survival, but also a minute longer that the remaining structure had to hold together against aerodynamic forces trying to complete the separation. The engineer technical sergeant Herbert Brownstein crawled back through the fuselage to assess the damage and provide Bragg with information about the structural situation. What Brownstein discovered was far worse than anyone had imagined from the cockpit, because the cut through the fuselage had severed virtually every major structural member, and the tail was indeed hanging on by minimal connection. He could see through the cut that the control cables running to the tail surfaces had been partially severed with only some strands remaining intact, and he judged that any aggressive maneuvering would certainly snap those cables, leaving the aircraft uncontrollable. Brownstein reported this assessment to Bragg, who acknowledged that they would need to fly the gentlest possible flight profile all the way home. The crew faced a difficult decision about weight distribution, because having people move around inside the damaged fuselage could shift the center of gravity and potentially cause the tail to break off completely. Bragg ordered everyone to remain in their current positions without moving unless absolutely necessary, and he specifically told Sergeant Zuck to stay in the tail section rather than attempting to crawl forward through the damaged area, because the movement might destabilize the precarious balance holding the aircraft together. This order essentially trapped Zook in the tail for the duration of the flight with no way to escape if the tail separated, but it was the only decision that gave the entire crew any chance of survival. The flight back to Biskra required approximately 90 minutes at the reduced airspeed Bragg was maintaining, and every minute felt like an hour as the crew waited to see if the structure would hold. The damaged area was visible to other bombers in the formation who flew alongside All-American to provide escort and witness, and the crews of those other bombers later reported that they could not believe the All-American was still flying because the damage appeared unsurvivable. One pilot from another B-17 radioed Bragg suggesting he should order bailout while they were still over friendly territory, but Bragg refused because he believed attempting to bail out would cause crew movements that would break the fuselage apart, killing anyone still aboard, including Zook, who was trapped in the tail. The psychological strain on the crew during this flight exceeded the physical danger because they were forced to simply wait and hope while having no control over whether they lived or died. The navigator continued providing heading updates to keep them on course toward Biskra. The bombardier scanned for German fighters that might attack their crippled bomber. The waist gunners watched the damaged fuselage section for any signs that the separation was worsening. Everyone avoided unnecessary movement and spoke only when essential, because even the vibration from loud talking might somehow contribute to structural failure. The shared experience of facing death together while being unable to do anything about it except trust their pilot and hope for luck created bonds between the crew that would last the rest of their lives. Lieutenant Bragg's flying during this period demonstrated extraordinary skill and judgment, because he had to balance multiple competing factors, including maintaining enough airspeed to keep flying while not going so fast that aerodynamic forces would tear the aircraft apart, descending to reduce altitude while not descending so steeply that he would stress the damaged structure, and keeping the aircraft level while dealing with the awkward handling caused by the tail section moving independently. The normal flight controls worked only partially because the severed control cables meant that control inputs from the cockpit reached the tail surfaces with reduced effectiveness, and Bragg had to make much larger control movements than normal to achieve even small changes in the aircraft's attitude. This meant he was constantly moving the controls, which was exactly what he wanted to avoid, because movement stressed the damaged connections, creating a paradox where he needed to use the controls to keep flying. but using the controls might cause the structural failure that would kill them all. The damaged fuselage created severe aerodynamic problems because the large hole disrupted the smooth airflow over the aircraft and caused unusual drag that affected handling. The tail section hanging at a slight angle from the main fuselage also disrupted airflow and created asymmetric drag that tended to yaw the aircraft to one side. Bragg compensated for these aerodynamic issues by using rudder trim and engine power adjustments to keep the bomber flying more or less straight. But the constant corrections required intense concentration and physical effort as he fought the controls throughout the 90-minute flight home. The navigator announced they were approaching Biskra with approximately 15 minutes flying time remaining to reach the airfield, and Bragg began the most dangerous phase of the flight, which was preparing for landing. Landing would require slowing down to approach speed, which would reduce lift and require more control inputs to maintain level flight, lowering landing gear and flaps, which would change the aircraft's weight distribution and aerodynamic characteristics, and actually touching down, which would subject the damaged structure to impact loads that might break it apart even after surviving the flight home. The alternative of bailing out over the airfield was rejected because Zook remained trapped in the tail and Bragg was not willing to abandon a crew member who had no way to escape. Bragg radioed the control tower at Biskra to report his situation and request priority landing clearance and emergency equipment standing by, and the tower controllers who were watching All American approach the airfield could see even from distance that the bomber was severely damaged. Fire trucks and ambulances positioned along the runway, while the tower cleared all other traffic from the area to give Bragg maximum options for his approach. The ground crews who had serviced All American that morning gathered to watch the landing, expecting to witness a crash because the damage visible even from the ground appeared unsurvivable. The landing approach required Bragg to slow the aircraft to approximately 130 miles per hour while maintaining enough altitude to clear obstacles and enough airspeed to maintain control, and he delayed lowering the landing gear and flaps until the last possible moment because those configuration changes would stress the damaged structure. When he finally lowered the gear approximately 2 miles from the runway, he felt the aircraft shudder as the gear extended into the airstream, and the changed weight distribution shifted the center of gravity, and for several seconds he thought the tail was breaking off as the rear section pitched downward before he managed to stabilize it with elevator input. Extending the flaps produced similar excitement as the increased drag and changed lift distribution caused the damaged tail section to rise suddenly before Bragg compensated with control inputs. The final approach brought All American over the runway threshold at approximately 120 miles per hour, which was slightly faster than normal landing speed. But Bragg wanted extra speed to maintain better control over the damaged aircraft. He eased back on the throttles while raising the nose very gently to reduce descent rate, and the main landing gear touched down on the runway with a surprisingly gentle impact given the circumstances. Bragg immediately cut power to all engines and applied brakes while holding the nose up to keep the tail from hitting the runway with excessive force. And the bomber rolled down the runway, gradually slowing, before finally coming to rest approximately halfway down the strip. The moment the aircraft stopped moving, the crew evacuated through every available exit, including the massive hole in the fuselage, and Sergeant Zook climbed out of the tail section with visible relief at finally escaping what had been his aerial prison for 90 minutes. Ground crews and emergency personnel who rushed to the aircraft stood in stunned silence, looking at the damage because no one could quite believe that the B-17 had flown 200 miles and landed successfully in this condition. The entire tail section was hanging at an angle from the main fuselage, connected by skin strips no more than 6 inches wide on each side, and some miraculously intact control cables, and engineers who examined the wreckage later calculated that the structural strength remaining was perhaps 10% of the original design capacity. Photographers documented the damaged aircraft extensively, producing images that became iconic representations of the B-17's legendary toughness and the skill of its crews. The photographs show clearly that the fuselage was cut almost completely through, with the tail section dropped slightly below the main fuselage line, and in several photos ground crew members are standing inside the hole, looking through to the other side, demonstrating the extent of the damage. These images were used extensively for morale purposes and for training to show crews that even catastrophic damage did not necessarily mean certain death if they remained calm and flew skillfully. The investigation into the collision determined that the German Me-109 pilot had been attempting a conventional firing pass from above and behind, but had misjudged his closure rate, possibly because of sun glare or combat stress, and the impact had been unintentional. The Me-109's propeller had functioned exactly like a circular saw cutting through the B-17's aluminum structure, and only the fact that the collision occurred along a diagonal rather than straight across the fuselage allowed some structural elements along the sides to remain intact. If the collision had been perpendicular to the fuselage axis, the tail would have separated completely and instantly, killing everyone aboard. But the diagonal impact left just enough structure on the sides to hold together through the flight home. Lieutenant Bragg received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his exceptional airmanship in flying the damaged bomber home, and his entire crew received commendations for their courage and discipline during the emergency. The award citation specifically noted that Bragg's decision to attempt flying the aircraft home rather than ordering bailout had saved lives because several crew members, including Zook, had no realistic way to bail out safely, and that his flying skill during the return flight demonstrated mastery of aircraft control under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. Bragg himself downplayed his role, noting that the B-17's rugged construction and his crew's discipline under pressure were more important factors than his individual skill. The damaged B-17 All-American was examined extensively by Army Air Force engineers who wanted to understand how the aircraft had survived such catastrophic damage and what lessons could be learned to improve structural design. The examination revealed that several factors had contributed to survival, including the diagonal angle of impact that left some structural elements intact, the relatively slow speed at which the collision occurred that reduced impact forces compared to high-speed collision, and the B-17's redundant structural design that provided multiple load paths so that failure of primary structure did not immediately cause complete collapse. These findings influenced subsequent bomber design by emphasizing structural redundancy and damage tolerance. The aircraft itself was declared unrepairable and was eventually scrapped, but its story lived on in military aviation as a legendary example of aircraft toughness and crew skill. The incident became required study in pilot training programs as an example of how to handle extreme structural damage, and the photographs of the damaged B-17 were used in countless briefings and training materials to illustrate that damaged aircraft could often fly farther and handle more stress than crews might initially believe. The lesson that crews should not give up hope even after catastrophic damage proved valuable throughout the war, as many other damaged bombers made it home when their crews refused to abandon aircraft that appeared doomed. The crew of All-American returned to combat flying within days and continued flying missions until completing their required number of combat missions, and they credited their experience surviving the collision with giving them confidence that they could handle any emergency that arose during subsequent missions. Several crew members reported that later emergencies that might have seemed terrifying to other crews were relatively minor compared to what they had experienced during the All-American incident, and this perspective helped them remain calm under pressure during subsequent combat operations. The comparison between the All-American incident and other famous cases of damaged bombers surviving catastrophic damage reveals interesting patterns about what types of damage aircraft could survive and what factors determined survival. The most famous B-17 survival story involves Memphis Belle, which completed 25 combat missions despite accumulating substantial damage. But Memphis Belle's damage was spread across many missions and never approached the single incident severity of All-American's collision damage. Other notable cases include bombers that made it home after losing engines, having control surfaces shot away, or suffering major fuel system damage. But All-American remains unique for flying 200 miles with the fuselage nearly severed. The psychological impact on the crew of experiencing such a catastrophic emergency and surviving affected different crew members in different ways. Some, like Sergeant Zook, who spent 90 minutes trapped in the barely attached tail section, suffered nightmares and anxiety about flying that persisted for months afterward. Others, like Lieutenant Bragg, appeared to handle the stress without lasting effects and continued flying combat missions with apparent calm. The variation in psychological responses demonstrated that individuals reacted differently to combat trauma even when exposed to identical experiences, and that resilience or vulnerability to stress could not be easily predicted based on personality or training. The incident also demonstrated the importance of crew coordination and communication during emergencies, because all Americans' survival depended not just on Bragg's flying skill, but on the entire crew following procedures and maintaining discipline despite their fear. The navigator continued providing accurate navigation information, allowing Bragg to fly the most efficient course home. The engineer crawled back to assess damage, providing critical information about the structural situation. The gunners maintained watch for enemy fighters, protecting the damaged bomber from follow-up attacks. Each crew member performed his role professionally, despite the catastrophic damage and uncertain outcome. And this crew coordination was as important as the pilot's skill in ensuring survival. The long-term legacy of the All-American incident extended beyond World War II as the story became part of aviation lore and was referenced in discussions about aircraft structural design, pilot training, and crew resource management. The photographs of the damaged bomber became iconic images representing both the toughness of the B-17 and the skill of its crews, and the incident was featured in numerous aviation history books, documentaries, and training materials. The lesson that aircraft could survive damage far beyond what seemed possible influenced post-war aircraft design by encouraging engineers to build in structural redundancy and damage tolerance, rather than designing for minimum weight. The incident also provided important data about human factors in aviation emergencies, because the All-American crew's experience demonstrated that even in circumstances that appeared hopeless, training and discipline could enable crews to function effectively and make correct decisions under extreme stress. The fact that Bragg made the difficult choice to attempt flying home rather than ordering bailout despite the visible catastrophic damage showed the importance of pilot judgment in emergency situations, and his success validated the principle that pilots should not give up on damaged aircraft without exhausting all options for recovery. The technical lessons from the All-American incident influenced B-17 design modifications and crew procedures for handling structural damage. Army Air Force issued bulletins to all B-17 crews describing the incident and emphasizing that the aircraft could survive damage that appeared catastrophic, and instructing crews to remain calm and assess their situation before making irreversible decisions like abandoning the aircraft. These bulletins cited All-American as proof that the B-17's structure was more robust than crews might believe, and that skillful flying could sometimes save aircraft that appeared doomed. The incident demonstrated several important principles about aircraft structural behavior under extreme stress. First, that catastrophic structural damage does not necessarily mean immediate structural failure, because redundant load paths can carry loads even after primary structure is destroyed. Second, that careful flying can reduce aerodynamic forces on damaged structure, allowing it to survive longer than expected. Third, that the most critical moments for damaged aircraft are configuration changes, like extending gear or flaps, because these changes redistribute loads and can cause delayed structural failure. All of these principles became part of standard pilot training and influenced how crews were taught to handle structural damage. The emotional bond between the All-American crew members that formed during their shared experience of surviving the collision remained throughout their lives, and they maintained contact with each other for decades after the war. They held periodic reunions where they would reminisce about their wartime service, and particularly about the February 1st, 1943, mission that none of them could ever forget. These reunions provided mutual support and understanding among men who had shared an experience that few others could comprehend, and the friendships that formed during 90 minutes of flying a crippled bomber home proved more enduring than many peacetime relationships. The story of All-American continues to inspire aviation professionals and military personnel as an example of how human skill, courage, and determination can overcome circumstances that appear impossible. The image of the B-17 flying home with its fuselage nearly severed represents the triumph of human agency over mechanical failure and demonstrates that outcomes are not predetermined even in the most dire circumstances. Lieutenant Bragg's decision to attempt the impossible rather than accepting defeat, and his skill in executing that decision successfully, serves as a model for how to approach emergency situations with clear thinking rather than panic. The incident reminds us that survival often depends as much on judgment and technique as on raw courage, because Bragg's success came not from heroic but dangerous actions, but rather from careful assessment of the situation, followed by precise execution of proper procedures adapted to unusual circumstances. His flying during the return to base avoided dramatic maneuvers and instead focused on minimizing stress on the damaged structure through gentle control inputs and optimal flight speeds, and this disciplined approach proved more effective than more aggressive flying would have been. The legacy of B-17F serial number 41-244406, All-American, endures in aviation history as the most damaged aircraft ever to complete a mission successfully. The bomber that should have broken apart in mid-air but didn't, the tail gunner who rode home in a section of aircraft hanging by threads, and the pilot who refused to give up on his crew or his aircraft, all became legendary examples of what was possible when skill combined with courage and determination. Their story continues to be told because it demonstrates enduring truths about human capability under pressure and about the remarkable toughness of both machines and the people who fly them. The physics of why All-American survived when by all logic it should have broken apart immediately involves complex interactions between aerodynamic forces, structural loading, and material properties that engineers spent considerable time analyzing after the incident. The primary longitudinal structural members of a B-17 fuselage consist of longerons, running the length of the aircraft on top, bottom, and sides, that carry bending loads from the tail surfaces and transmit those loads forward to the wing. The Me-109's propeller severed the top and bottom longerons completely and damaged the side longerons extensively, leaving perhaps 10 to 15% of the normal structural capacity to carry bending loads. Under normal flight conditions, this remaining structure would have failed almost immediately, but Bragg's gentle flying and reduced airspeed kept bending loads within the marginal capacity of the damaged structure. The control cables running from the cockpit to the tail surfaces normally provide redundant paths, so that if one cable breaks, the others can still transmit control inputs. The collision severed or damaged most of these cables, leaving only the minimum number required for basic control, and those remaining cables were frayed and weakened with individual strands broken. Each control input from Bragg stressed these weakened cables and increased the probability they would break completely, yet somehow they survived the entire 2-hour flight home, despite loads that approached their breaking strength hundreds of times. Engineers examining the wreckage found it difficult to explain how these cables had not failed and concluded that luck played as large a role as structural engineering. The aerodynamic effects of the massive hole in the fuselage created turbulent airflow over the entire aft section of the aircraft that should have caused severe buffeting and made the aircraft nearly uncontrollable. The hole acted like a giant air brake, creating enormous drag on one side of the fuselage and producing a yawing moment that Bragg had to counteract with rudder input. The turbulent air flowing through the hole also created unpredictable pressure loads on the interior structure that could have caused the weakened connections to fail at any moment. The fact that these aerodynamic loads did not cause structural failure during 2 hours of flight remains remarkable and suggests that the specific damage pattern somehow avoided creating the resonant vibrations that would have catastrophically amplified stress levels. The tail gunner Michael Zuck's experience during the flight home provides unique perspective on what it felt like to ride in an aircraft section that was essentially detached from the main fuselage. Zook later described feeling every gust of wind as a violent pitching or yawing motion because the tail section was moving independently from the rest of the aircraft, and he could see the main fuselage ahead of him flexing and moving in ways that seemed completely wrong. He reported that the worst moments came when the aircraft hit turbulence, or when Bragg made control inputs, because these movements caused the tail to thrash around violently, and he was certain each time that the remaining connections were breaking. The psychological stress of being trapped with no ability to escape or influence his fate while watching the structure deteriorate around him left Zook with permanent psychological scars that affected his ability to fly an aircraft for the rest of his life. The other crew members watching from the main fuselage had equally disturbing experiences, seeing the tail section moving independently and knowing that Zook was trapped back there unable to escape. The waist gunners, who had clear views of the damaged area, reported that they could see the tail section pitching up and down by several degrees relative to the main fuselage, especially during turbulence, and they watched the thin strips of metal skin that were the only structural connections flexing and bending in ways that seemed certain to cause failure. One waist gunner later said that he spent the entire flight home convinced that at any second the tail would break off completely, and they would watch helplessly as Zook plummeted to his death. And the relief when they finally landed safely was so overwhelming that he vomited from the emotional release. The decision-making process that led Bragg to attempt flying home rather than ordering bailout involved rapid assessment of multiple factors under extreme time pressure while experiencing physiological stress from the collision and its aftermath. Bragg had to consider that bailout would certainly result in loss of the aircraft and would probably result in injuries or deaths among crew members, either from bailout difficulties or from enemy capture on the ground, while attempting to fly home offered at least some possibility of saving both aircraft and crew, but risked catastrophic structural failure that would kill everyone aboard. The fact that Zook was trapped in the tail section made the decision somewhat easier because Bragg was not willing to order bailout, knowing that doing so would abandon Zook to certain death. But it also increased the stakes, because if the attempt to fly home failed, the entire crew would die, rather than just Zook. The landing phase presented unique challenges beyond those encountered during the crew's flight home, because landing required configuration changes and control inputs that would stress the damaged structure far more than level flight. Extending the landing gear shifted the aircraft's center of gravity aft and changed its aerodynamic characteristics in ways that required control inputs to compensate, and these control inputs stressed the weakened control cables and damaged structure. Lowering flaps created even greater disruption by massively increasing drag and changing lift distribution in ways that made the tail section want to pitch downward relative to the main fuselage. Bragg had to time these configuration changes carefully to minimize the stress on the damaged structure while ensuring he had the aircraft properly configured before reaching the point where landing became impossible. The actual touchdown presented the greatest risk, because impact loads from landing gear contacting the runway would travel through the airframe and stress every structural connection, including the critically weakened connections holding the tail section to the main fuselage. Bragg's technique of holding the nose up during the landing roll to delay nose wheel touchdown and minimize the forces transmitted to the tail demonstrated sophisticated understanding of structural loading and showed his ability to adapt standard procedures to unusual circumstances. The fact that the tail section remained attached during landing and during the deceleration on the runway remains almost miraculous given the forces involved. The ground crews and emergency personnel who witnessed All-American's landing described a collective holding of breath as the damaged bomber touched down because everyone watching expected the tail to break off at that moment. Fire trucks and ambulances were positioned along the runway, ready to respond to the crash they were certain would occur, and the medical personnel had prepared for mass casualties based on the assumption that the aircraft would break apart during landing. When the bomber instead rolled to a stop intact with all crew members climbing out alive and uninjured, the relief and amazement were palpable among everyone who had been watching. Several ground crew members later reported that seeing All-American land successfully was the most incredible thing they witnessed during their entire wartime service. The engineering analysis conducted after the incident focused intensively on understanding why the structure had survived when calculations suggested it should have failed within seconds of the collision. Boeing engineers examined the wreckage extensively and conducted stress analysis of the damaged structure to determine the actual loads it had experienced and compare those to the calculated ultimate strength of the remaining structural elements. Their analysis concluded that the structure had been operating at approximately 80 to 90% of its ultimate strength during much of the flight home, meaning that it was within 10 to 20% of catastrophic failure at all times. Any significant turbulence, any aggressive control input, or any additional damage would have pushed the loads beyond ultimate strength and caused complete structural failure. The investigation also revealed several fortuitous factors that had contributed to survival beyond Bragg's skill and the B-17's structural design. First, the collision had occurred at relatively high altitude, where the thin air reduced aerodynamic forces compared to sea-level flight. Second, the collision had severed the top and bottom fuselage structure, but left more of the side structure intact, and this pattern of damage happened to align with the load paths in a way that provided maximum residual strength. Third, the weather during the flight home had been relatively calm, without significant turbulence that would have stressed the damaged structure beyond its capacity. Fourth, the distance to the nearest friendly airfield had been just within the damaged aircraft's capability, because a longer flight would have allowed fatigue crack growth to weaken the structure further. Any of these factors being different might have resulted in structural failure and loss of all crew. The post-war careers of the all-American crew members reflected the varied ways that wartime service affected different individuals. Lieutenant Bragg remained in the Air Force after the war and eventually retired as a colonel after a distinguished career that included service in Korea and various peacetime assignments. He seldom spoke publicly about the All-American incident, preferring to let his achievements speak through the documented record rather than self-promotion, and colleagues who served with him in later years often did not know about his wartime heroism until learning about it from other sources. Bragg died in 1984, having lived a full life that extended far beyond his moment of extraordinary courage in February 1943. The tail gunner Michael Zuck had a more difficult post-war experience because his psychological trauma from being trapped in the tail section during the flight home manifested as severe anxiety about flying that never fully resolved. He attempted to continue flying combat missions after the All-American incident, but suffered panic attacks when entering aircraft and eventually was reassigned to ground duties for the remainder of the war. After returning to civilian life, Zook avoided flying and traveled by train or automobile, even when air travel would have been more convenient. And he struggled with nightmares about falling that psychiatrists linked to his experience watching the ground through the severed fuselage while trapped in the detached tail section. His story illustrates that survival does not mean absence of lasting harm, and that psychological wounds can be as debilitating as physical injuries. The comparison between All-American's damage and other famous cases of B-17 surviving extreme damage reveals interesting patterns about what types of damage were survivable and which were not. The bomber Memphis Belle completed 25 missions and returned to the United States for a publicity tour, but its accumulated damage from multiple missions never approached the single incident severity of All-American's collision damage. Another famous case involved a B-17 that continued flying after losing most of its nose section to flak, and the navigator who had been in the nose section managed to survive despite being exposed to the slipstream at 20,000 feet. That incident demonstrated human endurance rather than structural integrity, because the structural damage, while dramatic, was less severe than All-American's near severing of the entire fuselage. Perhaps the closest comparison to All-American in terms of structural damage survived is the case of a B-24 Liberator that had its tail surfaces nearly shot off by flak, but managed to fly home using unconventional control techniques. However, the B-24 incident involved damage to control surfaces rather than primary structure. And while the flying was extremely difficult, the aircraft itself was never in danger of breaking apart mid-flight. All-American remains unique for surviving primary structural damage that should have caused immediate airframe failure, and no other World War II bomber incident approaches it for the severity of structural damage survived. The influence of the All-American incident on post-war aircraft design manifested in several areas, including increased emphasis on structural redundancy, development of better methods for analyzing damage tolerance, and incorporation of fail-safe design principles that assumed structures would be damaged during service rather than designing for no damage. Boeing's subsequent commercial aircraft designs, including the 707 and 747, incorporated lessons learned from studying All-American survival by ensuring that multiple load paths existed for critical structural loads so that severing one path would not cause immediate catastrophic failure. The modern concept of damage-tolerant design that accepts that structures will be damaged and focuses on preventing catastrophic failure from damage can be traced in part to lessons learned from incidents like All-American. The story's enduring popularity in aviation circles relates to its dramatic visual impact, because the photographs of the severely damaged bomber are striking and memorable in ways that text descriptions of other incidents cannot match. The image of a large four-engine bomber flying with its fuselage cut nearly in half creates immediate visceral understanding of the severity of the situation in ways that descriptions of accumulated damage or partial structural failure do not. This visual dramatic impact, combined with the straightforward narrative of collision, flight home, and successful landing, creates a story that resonates across generations and cultures because it requires no specialized knowledge to appreciate the courage and skill demonstrated. The incident also provides inspiration beyond aviation circles because it represents universal themes of refusing to accept defeat, maintaining calm under pressure, and trusting in skill and preparation when circumstances seem hopeless. Bragg's decision to attempt the impossible rather than giving up, his methodical assessment of the situation despite the emotional and physical shock of the collision, and his careful execution of proper techniques adapted to unusual circumstances demonstrate problem-solving and leadership principles applicable far beyond flying damaged bombers. The story is often cited in leadership training and crisis management courses as an example of how to approach apparently hopeless situations with clear thinking and determination. The All-American incident reminds us that outcomes are not predetermined, even in the most dire circumstances, and that human agency matters even when facing situations that appear beyond individual control. The collision between the Me-109 and the B-17 created a situation that should have resulted in immediate deaths of everyone aboard the bomber, yet the combination of fortunate damage patterns, extraordinary pilot skill, crew discipline, and structural engineering margin created the possibility of survival. Bragg's decision to attempt that possibility rather than accepting defeat, and his successful execution of that attempt transformed a certain tragedy into an inspiring survival story that continues to resonate decades later. The forgotten ground crews who serviced All-American before its final flight and who examined the wreckage afterward also deserve recognition because aircraft maintenance and engineering analysis were as important as flying skill in enabling the bomber's combat operations. The maintenance crews who ensured the aircraft was mechanically sound before takeoff created the conditions that allowed it to survive catastrophic damage, and the engineers who analyzed the wreckage afterward advanced understanding of structural behavior under extreme conditions. Their contributions were less visible than the pilot's dramatic flight home, but were equally essential to both the immediate survival and the lasting lessons learned from the incident. The story of B-17F All-American ultimately represents the triumph of human determination and skill over mechanical failure, and demonstrates that the impossible sometimes becomes possible when courage, training, and luck align. The image of that damaged bomber flying home across 200 miles of hostile territory with its fuselage nearly severed, carrying 10 crew members who refused to give up hope despite catastrophic damage, stands as enduring testament to the human capacity to overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles through combination of individual skill, team coordination, and unwillingness to accept defeat. Their achievement reminds us that survival often depends as much on mental attitude and proper technique as on raw courage, and that maintaining discipline and following proper procedures under extreme stress can mean the difference between tragedy and triumph.